This is a Grant Maker Skills and Strategies program. And we have friends from all over the St. Louis region, and we have a couple friends who are joining us as well from Kansas City. So welcome to you, those of you who have been able to dial in from across the state. We recognize technology is really not the perfect way for us to meet. It's not a substitute for meeting in person. But we originally planned the program, of course, to have our guests come to St. Louis. We were very excited to host them and have you meet them in real life. Sadly, COVID-19 has ruined that plan to some extent. So we owe you guys, those of you who are speakers today, we owe all of you some toasted ravioli when you do come to St. Louis. We are grateful that you were flexible about pivoting to an online conversation about something really interesting and important, productive approach to grant-making practices that enhance funder-grantee relationships. There are some really wonderful lessons to absorb today. And whether you're responding to a crisis and you can use some of these skills right now, or you're developing a long-term approach to your partnerships, TBP, Trust-Based Philanthropy, is highly applicable. So through the magic of Zoom, we've got some of our coasts. Our favorite coasts are represented today. That would be the East Coast. We're delighted to be joined by Shadi Salehi, who is the director of Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And from the East Coast, we've got Maylee Walker, executive director of the Clennell Foundation in Philadelphia, and Vanessa Garrison, the founder and COO of Girl Trek, one of her former grantees. So in just a minute, Shadi's going to offer some background information on the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. She's going to introduce our guest speakers more formally, and she's going to also moderate the discussion today. Just to manage your expectations, there are a total of about 8 slides today from start to finish, and we'll have ample time at the end for Q&A, but you can also put questions in the chat box throughout. We will wrap everything up today by 10:25 to give you all time for some evaluation and some closing remarks before we send you on your way. First, some quick logistics. We are recording today's presentation to be posted on GCG's website as a member resource. If you have any concerns about this, please let us know after the call. You have all been muted upon entry to the Zoom meeting today, which is why no one's laughing at my jokes, because you're all muted. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself, or you can type into the chat box. Again, at the bottom, the chat box is, you're able to just kind of go all the way down where it says chat and type in your question. You can hold questions for the speakers till the Q&A portion. That might be helpful. If you're joining by phone and you aren't able to see us online, you enter *6 to unmute yourself or to mute yourself. And another tip, which I mentioned earlier, is if you want to put us in gallery view, you go all the way over to the top right part of your screen, and you can switch from speaker view to gallery view. You'll see more of your colleagues if you're on gallery view. Under the participant list, as Kelly mentioned, if you could go in and change your name, so it lists your first name and last name in your organization, it's just helpful for us to track who's on the call today and for others to know who is joining us. So thank you, everyone. Kelly, did we hit all the key announcements before we start?
I think so, and just one more note for folks joining us on the phone only. You got the slides ahead of time so you can follow along. But then also, if you have a question during the presentation, feel free to email me if you don't want to, if it's too tricky getting off of mute, and I will ask that to the group if you're joining us by phone only.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to Kelly and Heather for pivoting also and helping us to get the magic of Zoom into our lives so that we can continue with this program. Thank you, Kelly, very much, and Heather as well. Okay, now, thank you, everyone. I'll turn this over to Shadi.
Thank you, Deb. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of your faces. Again, as Deb mentioned, I'm Shadi Salehi. I am the director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And today we're going to have a pretty packed agenda. So we're actually right on time. So we're doing great. We're starting with just right now background and introductions, and then from there we'll move into the principles of trust-based philanthropy. So we'll kind of walk through the key building blocks of what really embodies a trust-based approach. We'll have kind of a reserved portion for Q&A, but we do encourage you during the principles section especially. There will be a lot of story sharing. We'll be doing a bit of a kind of live Q&A around the principles between Vanessa and Maylee. We welcome you to enter in your questions during that time, and I'm happy to bring those questions to our speakers. We do have a reserved section for Q&A, so if you have a question that comes to you later, that's a great time to ask it. We'll do a quick sum up of the key takeaways and next steps. And then, of course, we have a closing survey that we encourage you to fill out, especially as we think about future programming around this content. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, this is a peer-to-peer learning and advocacy initiative, really designed to connect funders to share and learn around trust-based practices, ultimately with the goal of making trust-based practices the norm in philanthropy. The core of trust-based philanthropy recognizes the inherent power imbalances that exist between foundations and nonprofits. And ultimately, we believe philanthropy will be more successful and rewarding and effective if funders approach these grantee relationships from a place of trust, transparency, and humility. We are in a particular moment right now where many trust-based practices are being embraced. The core of trust-based philanthropy is recognizing those inherent power imbalances and working proactively to alleviate the funder-imposed burdens, often unintentional, that really hold back nonprofits from doing the work that their mission-focused work. So in this particular moment with this global pandemic, we are seeing a shift that is happening around toward trust-based philanthropy. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that funders are realizing, and as you all can attest to, I'm sure, that in this particular moment, we are really experiencing a need to free up nonprofits from those burdens to really focus on that work. We're noticing a trend toward unrestricting project grants. People are extending their grant programs and moving grants much more quickly. And these are indicative of a recognition that in this particular moment, it is really important to trust our nonprofit partners to focus on the work at hand. And Kelly, we can jump out of the slides for a second. Thank you. And so in what we're seeing now is that there's a real need to trust nonprofits, and it's this really interesting trend. So what we're excited about is this opportunity for trying out some of these practices with the hope that perhaps these practices can sustain in the long run. The Trust-Based Philanthropy Project is a growing community of practice. Today, we're thrilled to have Maylee Walker from the Clinial Foundation in Philadelphia sharing about their journey on trust-based philanthropy, and Vanessa Garrison, COO of Girl Trek and former grantee partner of the Clinial Foundation, sharing about what that relationship looks like, walking us through these trust-based practices, and inviting a discussion around your questions on, how does this actually work? How do you put it into practice? What does it look like? And we also recognize that a lot of the practices that we're going to be talking about are not necessarily new. As those of you who filled out the pre-assessment survey, we can see that a lot of these practices are already in play in many organizations, or there's a desire to make a shift toward these practices. So with the intention of this project, we are really looking to support that kind of peer learning, support you in your journeys and trying to get there, and help problem solve around ways that you can fully embrace some of these practices and really encourage that discussion. We recognize that there's a lot of different manifestations and adaptations of trust-based practices, and we really welcome different examples. So today we will be having story sharing from Clinial Foundation. I'll be offering some context from a national level of what we're seeing in other funder partners. And ultimately, I will say that our partnership with the Gateway Center is really important to this initiative. The Trust-Based Philanthropy Project is a 5-year initiative. We're really here to support peer networking, peer learning, knowledge building around this practice. We'll be producing a lot of tools and resources to support the knowledge building. But we see our partnerships with regional associations like Gateway Center as really critical. to us fostering a community of practice and fostering that peer learning. I say all of that because if you're really interested in digging deeper and really looking for ways to operationalize some of these practices in your foundations, we would love to explore the opportunity for ongoing programming, other stuff that we can do in partnership with Gateway Center that can help you and your respective organizations and colleagues learn more about this practice. So keep that in mind. This is not our first and only discussion. We also recognize there's a lot of wisdom in the room. So you have your own experiences to contribute to this knowledge building that we welcome during the discussion today. Okay, so on to our speakers. Kelly, if you don't mind showing that slide with our speakers. Thank you. So here we are. You can also see our faces on video, but just to kind of keep us straight during the discussion, I wanted to first introduce Maylee Walker. If you could share a little bit, Maylee, about Clinial Foundation, where you are and your focus, and maybe share a little bit about your partnership with Vanessa before we bring Vanessa in.
Wonderful, and good morning, everybody. I am so excited to see you all, and I was so excited that we were going to still have this today, you know, given the pandemic and not being able to be there in person. And I really come to you not as an expert, I come to you as another foundation who is really we're trying to do what the best we can during these times. And so I'm here both to learn from you as well, and to share what's been easy for us, what's been hard for us, and what we're still trying to struggle through in this trust-based framework. Just to give you some background about us as a foundation, so the Clinial Foundation is located outside of Philadelphia. We just celebrated our 50th birthday, so we're about 50 years old, and we're a family foundation. And so in this context of trust-based philanthropy, I think one key thing that's important is that our board, because it's a family foundation, one, they stay very private in our philanthropy, and two, they're very engaged. So we have about 15 to 20 family members actively involved in the foundation every year, reading proposals, serving on the finance committee, and that's a big part of what we do. Our grant budget is typically between 3 to 3.5 million, and we have 3 staff. So we are on the smaller side of foundations and the work that we do. We have 4 different grant programs, and the geography of those range from the Philadelphia region to the New England Mid-Atlantic area. Even though they are very different, all our grants are general operating multi-year support, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. I was really excited that Vanessa was able to join me today. So Girl Trek was a grantee in one of our grant programs called the Emerging Leaders Fund, which is for emerging organizations. And when I think about Vanessa, I think of a person who is so committed, so passionate about the work she does, and she and her co-partner, Morgan, are probably one of the most aligned leaders that I've seen in the nonprofit sector with their work in their personal lives and the work that they do every day. And we have an annual retreat for the grantees. And at the end of one of the retreats, we asked every person in the room, including the board that was there that evening, to say one word that described how they felt about the Emerging Leaders Fund. And Vanessa was the first person to say family. And so that's why I wanted to hear her today, to hear, you know, why she said that. And other people have said that after that, but she was really the first person to bring that reality to me around the importance of our work. And they also do work in St. Louis. And so she also probably is familiar with many of the organizations that you support. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vanessa for an introduction.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm so glad to see you, Maylee, and I'm so grateful to the team that worked behind the scenes to put this together. I will say in full transparency, we did several different calls for prep for this, and I feel prepared, and also yet I feel a little anxious on this morning. And I'm actually just want to share that I talk in front of large groups all the time, and Girl Trek does tons of media, and I have been a Zoom aficionado over these last 3 weeks. And yet in this moment, I'm feeling a little anxious. And I feel okay to say that because that is the type of relationship that Maylee and I have, and because we are in a learning space. And so before I actually even introduce a little bit about the work that Girl Trek does, I'm going to offer a little blessing to everyone on the call. I hope it's okay with you, but we're in different times. And so I would invite everyone to consider that nothing we do needs to be business as usual anymore. And that as the universe is shifting, it's actually calling us to reconsider, just to reconsider everything. So I usually start my morning with a reflection, and this morning I'm meditating on the collected poems of Lucille Clifton. She's an amazing poet if you do not know her. I offer this to everyone on the call, no matter where you are. I offer this blessing for yourself, for your family, for the communities that you serve. It's called Blessing the Boats at St. Mary's. This is the actual poem that they say in New Orleans to bless the shrimp boats each season before the shrimp boats go out. And it says, may the tide that is entering even now, the lip of our understanding, carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever. And may you in your innocence sail from this to that. So I offer that, Maylee, just because it helps to ground me a little bit in the work that I do. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Girl Trek, we are a national movement and public health organization. We currently serve more than 600,000 women, Black women across the United States. Our goal is to mobilize 1 million Black women to reclaim their health and communities through the tradition and habit of walking. First, because walking is the single most powerful thing that a woman can do for her health, and Black women die at higher and faster rates than any other group in the country from chronic disease. Long before we were the headlines in this COVID-19 crisis around how it's impacting African American communities, Girl Trek understood that we were the canaries in the coal mine, that what the country experiences that we experience tenfold over. From both a health standpoint and an economic impact, this COVID-19 crisis has been ravaging the Black community, and yet there is an undeniable sense of hope, of resilience, of we were prepared for this time, of we have already been building the infrastructure to respond not just to this, but to the needs of our families and communities. So I feel particularly excited and prepared for the work that is ahead. Our work will continue to be around getting 1 million Black women healthy through a habit of daily walking. Once those women are active and walking, we train them to be public health activists and community organizers so that they can work across all of the root causes that keep our communities unwell. That includes isolation, and so women work to lead walking teams in their communities. It includes economic viability, and so we train women to have wage earning jobs in the public health sector. It includes policy that affects our built environment and whether or not we have access to affordable fruits and vegetables, whether the infrastructure in our community makes it safe for us to walk. So across those different areas in an environment, and how we are stewards of our natural environment, and how we also use the environment as a healing tool for Black women. So that's the work that Girl Trek does in broad strokes. Morgan, who is my co-founder, who wishes she could be here today, and I started Girl Trek 10 years ago. The Clenille Foundation was one of the first places that we went to. We were referred to the Clenille Foundation via Echoing Green, and we have had an amazing relationship with them, both as grantees and as alumni of the Emerging Leader Fellowship. I never miss a gathering at the Clenille Foundation where we get together on this amazing farm every September. It speaks to the power of the Clenille Foundation. They gather some of the most amazing leaders from around the country, and we never miss it. And we all have packed schedules and a lot of stuff going on. But because Clenille both has an eye for excellence and holds us accountable to real impact in our communities, but does it in a way that allows us to show up as whole selves as leaders and to talk about our fears and our vulnerabilities, it really is like family, Maylee. So I'm grateful to be on this call.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you for that, the opening reflection. That was really, really wonderful. And thank you for reminding us that This is not business as usual. We're all at home. You know, some people might have a toddler crawling on the floor or a pet, you know, coming in, and you're juggling a million things. So thank you, Vanessa, for reminding us of that and grounding us. I really appreciate that. So you are hearing a little tidbit about the relationship between Clinial Foundation and Girl Trek. And what I really love about the intro from Vanessa and Mei Lee is that there's something kind of that foundational that supports this whole practice that really is about the how we show up and how we are in relationship. So today we're going to talk through these principles of trust-based philanthropy, but remember the overarching thing that kind of drives and connects all that is leading from a place of values, leading from a place of relationship, leading from a place of humility, and embracing that in those relationships. So that's one thing that we kind of want to encourage, even though we're breaking it down into these principles and practices. Those are kind of the practical manifestations of this, but it's always going to be values-based at the end of the day. And you heard a little bit of that in both Mei Lee's and Vanessa's introductions. Before we jump into the principles, given what's happening right now, we thought it would be relevant to open with Vanessa and Mei Lee sharing how their respective organizations are responding to this moment. And I want to start with you, Vanessa, especially given the focus of your work as a health organization. We know that this situation is having immediate impacts on your organization. Can you share with the group how you're responding, and then also in particular, what shifts have you seen from your funder partners?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we are responding, you know, with the kind of what I would say yoga principle of trying to find the balance between effort and ease, right? There is this immediate sense of need in our communities, and this need to immediately respond, pivot, align programming so that we can be responsive to the needs of our community. And yet there is also the wisdom of understanding that in times like this, also staying the course and seeing us on the other side of the mountain is just as important, right? And so we're trying to find that balance on a daily basis between where are we responding to the immediate needs of women versus where are we staying the course around a plan that we've long believed in that's going to not just respond to the surface level issues, but that's going to go deep. So immediately the way that we did that was actually first, and this is something that I think is a values thing that we do share with Clinial Foundation, we first actually just had to assess the needs of our actual team and staff. And so we actually have shifted from a 5-day work week to a 3-day work week, which some people might feel is radical, but we were like, we are a team of all women. We are serving 600,000 women. We are both living through this crisis and trying to serve in this crisis. And the self-care of our team, that they come out on the other side of this healthy and alive and able to do the work with us, was a priority. And so we immediately convened our team. We talked about their actual needs, how they're caring for their children and their families during this time, thankfully without needing to cut their pay. I say that to say that we have a lot of unrestricted funding that we advocate for and that comes in, and partners who understand that, so that in this moment of crisis, without having to go back to them and ask them to change grant agreements or terms, we were able to shift funding from programs that were being canceled or changed, and we shifted them in 2 important ways. One, to ensure that we could keep our staff on full time, but to provide them some space to be caregivers, which is what we did. And then 2, we had some major programming in the summer that was canceled. Obviously health and summer, that's when Girl Trek is at its height. We shifted that programming funding into an emergency fund to support our women out in the field, our volunteers. It's been heartbreaking. We allocated originally $100,000, and we had 524 requests in 24 hours for more than $500,000. These are from organizers and volunteers in our movement whose names we know, whose families we know, who couldn't put food on the table, who can't purchase medication right now, who can't put gas in their car to get from here to there to their essential jobs that people are saying are essential, but they don't have the income to actually manage through these times. And of course, maybe I'm the St. Louis area and the Kansas City area in particular, I think you do know this, but Black women share a disproportionate burden of healthcare jobs, of they're delivering your mail, they're bagging your groceries, they're doing Instacart, they're driving Uber. So in particular, as we're telling people to stay home, our population is pretty vulnerable. So we shifted some of our funding to both support our staff and actually to support just a fund to support the organizers who have been helping us. That was the first thing. The second thing we did, which was a hard decision, the core programming that Girl Trek does is walking, right? We believe in walking to save your lives. The CDC recommendation of 5 days a week, 30 minutes a day. The information is so constant and ever changing around, is it safe to walk, where it's safe to walk? The guidelines from federal to state or local are not consistent. And we just did not feel comfortable in this moment where our population has so many underlying health conditions of promoting walking outside as our core programming. That was a major shift for us to announce that we were publicly going to pause walking. What we did do, though, was then immediately transition into really robust online and digital programming that we were able to stand up in the matter of days that helps women who are at home. All of you can log in, stay active, right? Get your bodies moving. And we did it from both a mind, body, spirit perspective. So on our social platforms, on our website, we do online programming every day, daily prayer, meditation, we do fitness classes, we do yoga, we do dance, we have a Friday night sing-along, a happy hour. Just what are the things that that people can lean into right now, especially because when you look at our population, they are single head of household, they are in the households with multi-generational people, they are caring for not just their children, but the elderly. So it's particular stresses and pressures that have always contributed to a health crisis that are amplified right now. So we've made those shifts, and we've tried to look at those shifts, again, both from an internal perspective around the shifting of our work week to then the shifting of our program to respond to it. So those are some of the immediate things that we're doing.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. There's so much packed in there that I think is really instructive from a trust-based philanthropy standpoint. First and foremost, Vanessa is really reminding us how much nonprofits are really on the front lines. They have relationships with communities that are experiencing the impact of this current situation firsthand. And in many ways, our nonprofits are the ones that are there working to respond to those community needs. And one of the things that has enabled Vanessa's team to be so responsive is that she has this pool of unrestricted funding that has allowed the organization to be responsive and nimble in this current moment. And that's just another reminder and another kind of reason behind why so many foundations are making those shifts to restricted grants, because there are needs that are so urgent that require that kind of responsiveness.
Yeah, and can I say something here in Maylee? This is, you can even, I don't know this to be for sure true, but I do, I believe this in terms of instructional for everyone who's joined in around trust-based philanthropy. Even before we get to the idea, to the point which is really important around the unrestricted funding, something that the Clinell Foundation does that I would encourage this entire sector to start to do is they take chances on leaders that are close to the problem. And trust-based philanthropy has to actually start with you understanding who and what you are investing in. And while the Clinell Foundation has a rigorous application process, while they hold us to the highest standards around expectations of metrics and outcomes and vision and change theory and how we plan to execute on our plan and build up infrastructure, they also, I believe, and Maylee, please speak to this, intentionally actually seek out or at least create space and opportunity for non-traditional leaders like myself to come into this space and get significant capital and funding so that we can do the work. And that is something that, as a Black woman leading an organization that serves almost 1 million Black families right now, we are rare in this space, and that feels unacceptable to me. And so even to start this conversation, I just want to acknowledge that there are not a lot of Black women leader nonprofits leading organizations for Black folks. And yet, and we can say this for people of color, Native communities, Asian Pacific Islander, Latinx community, where we have leaders who are representative of that community, we will have more powerful solutions. So Maylee, maybe you can talk to, does the Clinell Foundation talk about that behind the scenes, and what is your kind of process for identifying leaders? I know you asked for recommendations, which I gratefully appreciate, and will say is one of the first things I will say is Maylee never fails to say, hey Vanessa, who do you know out there who is doing the good work that Clinell should be looking at?
Definitely. I think a key part, especially in the Emerging Leaders Fund, and that there's some structural pieces to what Vanessa was saying that made it possible. It's a 4-year general operating grant program. So what we find is that after those 4 years, the relationship doesn't end. And that wasn't the same when we did single year general operating support. So for example, Vanessa's partner, who she mentioned, Morgan, facilitated a retreat for us, for the grantees, just a couple of years ago. And to Vanessa's point, we get nominations for that grant program. And so some of the folks who fit the best, I get from a text. I was one time on vacation and got a text from Maria, who you know. And she said, Maylee, there's this guy named Q who runs an amazing organization called Made in Brownsville in New York City. You have to check it out. That's all the text said. And we get about 120 nominations, and he was selected. So I think it's listening to the nonprofit sector as our teachers through the process. It makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both. And Kelly, if you could put up the ecosystem slide, please. Thank you. So these are some of the, hopefully you can see it. It's a little tiny on my laptop screen, but it's just generally kind of the way we think about this. And it's a lot of it is exactly what Vanessa was just sharing. So there's these values. It's about trusting the leadership of people who are closer to the ground. It's about recognizing that a lot of nonprofit leaders really have a clear sense of what needs to happen in their communities, and being mindful and intentional about freeing them up so that there can be focus on that, and also trusting the leadership of people who are traditionally underrepresented in the space. Thank you for raising that, Vanessa. That's another element of a lot of this work, and that's where doing the homework really comes in. The values that drive this approach are all here. So it's about power sharing, it's about equity, it's humility, transparency, curiosity, and collaboration. And the idea is about centering relationship. And the practices that we'll be outlining are embodiments of how to center relationship. When we talk about relationship, it doesn't mean that we're talking about funders and grantees being best friends that are, having lunch every day or anything like that. It's really about relationship in partnership towards shared goals. And we're going to talk through what that looks like. Next slide, please. So these are the 6 principles of trust-based philanthropy. We've been touching upon them, and we're going to invite Maylee and Vanessa to actually walk us through what these look like with Clinial Foundation. And Vanessa will be kind of posing some questions to Maylee about these elements. We're going to keep these up on screen so you can follow along. We're going to kind of dip into each one of these practices. We do invite you to ask questions, so I'll be keeping an eye out on the chat box. And of course, we'll have some questions, a portion for questions toward the end. Before we jump in, Maylee, I wanted to invite you to share a little bit about Clinial Foundation's trust-based journey. We often talk about trust-based philanthropy as a journey. You're never really done with the practice. A lot of the practice is about constant self-reflection and refinement. It's a constant assessment of relationships. So you're never necessarily done with the practice of trust-based philanthropy, and everyone is somewhere along in that journey of embracing these principles. So Maylee, can you share a little bit about how you first heard about trust-based philanthropy, and also part of the reason why you're here is that your grantee partners have actually asked Clinial Foundation to advocate more about how you fund and how you practice. If you could share a little bit about that before we jump into the principles.
Definitely. So a little over a year ago, I got an email from a named Phil Lee, who I didn't know, from New York, and asked if I would go to a meeting around trust-based philanthropy. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that a couple of our grantees had recommended us to attend this meeting. And so I trusted them, and I said, hey, if they think it's worth my time, I should go. So I knew little about it. What I did know coming in is that as a foundation, 2 of our core values actually have been mentioned on this call. So relationships and humility are 2 of the 4 core values. And so we went. And it was one of the most amazing meetings where we were with several other foundations, where our goal as a foundation was not necessarily getting the money out the door, but how do we make social change through trust? And it was really transformational because I felt like it was taking the pieces that were aspirational to us and putting them in practice, and then giving us a framework to say, okay, well, yeah, we do that well. Well, what about that aspect? And so it gave us a goal as a foundation that takes a relationship approach or tries to take a relationship approach, and really help put that trust piece in context. Where it was strong at that point was in the Emerging Leaders Fund, because that is our longest grant program. It's 4 years. We did not know if it, quite honestly, if it existed as strong in our other grant programs. What we did do later that year is we did the Center for Effective Philanthropy Grantee Perception Survey Report. And so in that, it did confirm to us that those aspects of trust building were in our other 3 grant programs. But before that, we were a little hesitant. We didn't know, because some of those grant programs were 2 years or 3 years. They focus more traditionally on the organization, not the leader in the organization. So with that knowledge, it really helped us figure out where we're strong and where we have work to do.
Thank you. And now I'm going to invite Vanessa and Mei Lee to walk us through the principles. So Kelly, if you could put those principles back on screen, please. Okay, I'm going to invite you two to take it away from here. We're a little truncated, so we'll have about 5 minutes for each principle, roughly.
Okay, and keep us moving, Shadi. If we stick too much on one, just tell us and we'll move to the next one. So I thank you for all of those who filled out the survey before. So I'm going to refer to that because I thought that was really helpful and instructive in looking at these principles. So for giving multi-year restricted funding, this was actually the lowest percent of all of you. 25% of you said that you do this, and many said that you want to do this more. This is a transition that the Clenille Foundation made in 2017. Before that, the only grant program that was truly unrestricted was the Emerging Leaders Fund. And hearing from, as you have heard from Vanessa so far, it had such a big impact on our foundation. And we realized that we were able to go deeper with that program and learn more and give more flexibility to grantees. So our board said, hey, let's do this for all of our grant programs. And so that shift happened in 2017. And I have to tell you, since that time, we've never had a board member and we've never had a grantee say go back to single year project funding. So that should tell you something in that process. I do want to say, though, what we did learn from the grantee perception report, while we were 100% unrestricted funding and 100% multi-year funding, all our grantees said, yes, we were all multi-year, but only 68% felt that we were unrestricted. So that's something we're working on now to reconfirm and really emphasize that it is unrestricted funding, but that wasn't the perception of all our grantees.
Mei Lee, a quick question for you. How did you work with your board to make that shift? Was there kind of a readiness for multi-year unrestricted funding? What were the discussions you had leading up to that?
Yeah, I think there was, and we actually have 2 board members on the call today. Again, one real push was the Emerging Leaders Fund and the powerful impact and the lessons learned we were having from that. And then the other one was, it felt at our board meetings, a lot of our updates focused on numbers. Number of LOIs, number of proposals through, versus what are we really learning? So in that process, when we did that, we actually, before we did the multi-year grant making, we were probably at about 140 grants a year, and now we're at 68. So we did cut the number of grants that we awarded by half, and that was a painful process because to decide you can't fund everybody was really, really hard. But through that process, we also took one grant cycle and just very informally asked every organization in that grant cycle, give us best practices that you hear in the foundation world. You know, you don't have to critique us, that's uncomfortable, but what do you hear? And multi-year unrestricted funding came out so high, and we shared those quotes with the board, and when the board read that, they said we have to do it. So again, it was the grantee voice directly to the board. So do you have a question, Vanessa?
No, it's funny. I have a reflection mainly.
Or reflection, whatever you want.
It's not even a question. It is that what I recognized when you were saying unrestricted funding, I was like, I could feel the anxiety, just like I could feel it rising in the air on this call, because I think there is such a perception around unrestricted funding that people are going to be irresponsible, or they're not tracking metrics, or they're, being frivolous, when in fact, what I actually think is that unrestricted funding is acknowledging innovation in a space, which for me is the best ideas have intersectionality. The best ideas build on each other so that we are building solutions that have really strong nodes. And when we just fund one project, at least in the Girl Trek universe, it's really fake. It means that we have likely on the grant application elaborated or gone deep in specific areas because we think the funder is interested. But our work is actually always to step back, look at the big picture, ask what is the ecosystem, where from healthcare to physical activity is Girl Trek trying to have an inflection point, and how do we pull all those things together? That's where you need unrestricted funding. When people just invest in the projects that they want, they're actually doing a disservice to the world we live in and the vision that says that we should actually be looking for the connections, because the connections are what are going to put us all out of business, which is what I hope we're all in this for, right? Is how are we eliminating these problems, not how are we just sustaining them over a long time. So unrestricted funding gives people the permission to do that innovation type of work that says that, not everything is going to fit in a clean little box and be wrapped up in this one particular way. The other thing that unrestricted funding does, and this is something that I felt particularly from the Clinil Foundation as a new leader, right, as an emerging leader, is you said from the very beginning with that money, we believe in your vision. We are going to walk side by side with you and see you to a point that we can all celebrate together. That's how it felt. So it felt immediately, it transformed us from a funder relationship to a partner relationship, because it felt like Clinil was as invested in this bigger vision and outcome as Morgan and I were. And you didn't just say it, but you put your money where your mouth is over several years to give us the actual time to have the proof points that we need. Because often what happens on the project funding is it has these unrealistic timelines. It has metrics that I feel like are in a silo that don't speak to each other. So that's the power for me of the unrestricted funding, and in particular what Clinil does with their funding.
Thank you. And we got one question from Ann Vasquez of the Lutheran Foundation. Maylee, how do you handle unrestricted multi-year grants for new grantees where there's no existing relationship? How does Clinil handle that?
So they are all, every grant is unrestricted multi-year. And so that ties actually into the next point around doing the homework. That, we probably do traditional due diligence with other with other foundations. And there are foundations that in this trust-based philanthropy, and this is an area where we're still trying to figure out, where they actually do all the work and the grantees do none. We still have the traditional proposal. We don't use the comment application for proposal, so that does take more time. But in talking with the organizations, really doing our due diligence, we're happy and we're confident, and we keep in touch with them through the process. And so also I think another reality, we understand this in the business world. If you write a business plan and then you have your business go, everybody knows, they joke, you throw that business plan out the window, and whatever happens, you have your vision. It's no different than in the nonprofit world. And I have to say, with the Emerging Leaders Fund, we do ask them to say, hey, what are your milestones and annual milestones? Out of all the organizations over the past 10 years in this grant program, only one has followed those milestones year by year. We can't expect organizations to follow milestones. We don't follow our own milestones at foundations. We make pivots and we make changes. And for some reason, I feel like when we then give a grant, we expect them to follow them. So actually in our proposal, we specifically have in that section where we say, write your annual milestones for the next 4 years. The next sentence says, we understand that they may change. And so if we're there learning with them and understanding the changes that happen in our environment, nobody could have predicted this pandemic. None of us could have. So how could we expect the organizations to know that?
Yeah, Maylee, when you were talking, I was like, I got stuck on one point, and I'm like, is this true? Or it's something that I mean, it is true, but I was like, this is actually even a bigger point that we could have a whole other convening on another time. But when you were talking about the business plan, I was like, this is to me actually an opportunity for a really big, bold conversation, because the fact is, if I have a business plan, and especially if I'm a white male, for the record, with a business plan, and I have an idea for a technology that's going to help your water faucet turn on hot to cold, not necessary, but it's a nice convenience, and I take it to Silicon Valley, you're going to have a ton of investors who give me R&D money, right? They're going to say, here's like $2 million, and you try it out, do 10 patents, do 7 designs, and at the end of the day, the faucet may not even come to market. We might decide at the end that that was whack and we're going to pivot. That's what we are allowed to do in the for-profit space when we're dreaming up ideas to, by the way, for consumers to purchase, to spend their money in this world, right? We believe in investing, and it's like, let's try, and it's like all these different things in a lab somewhere that they're figuring out that we never see, that we're investing tons of money in. But then you get into the nonprofit space and you say, we want to solve the problem of homelessness or obesity with millions of people. Here's $150,000 to do it. And you better get it right on the first try with these milestones or metrics. Otherwise, you may not get the funding again. It's just not even realistic.
Yeah, and you got to do it in 12 months. And yeah, you know, and that's where the multi-year part really comes in. And I appreciate that question about how do you engage in a multi-year relationship with a new prospective grantee that you have no existing relationship. I love that Clinial Foundation works on doing the homework, building the relationship before the funding is administered. Some other funders will offer kind of initial relationship building grants. You know, some people, we have one funder partner that calls it a catalyst grant. It's a $5,000 initial grant to create space for the initial relationship building, and then give it a year to see if the values and mission are aligned. And then they move into a multi-year relationship. There's a number of other funders that have done that. So if there is some hesitance to jump right in, that is one strategy that some of our funder allies have used. And I really do appreciate Maylee's connection to doing the homework, because that is a big part of a trust-based approach, and it looks really different. So sometimes it just means, you heard it in Vanessa's example, anytime Maylee connects with Vanessa, she's asking Vanessa about other promising organizations, other promising leaders out there, people who are emerging. Kind of that is part of that doing the homework process, asking around beyond your usual circles, listening, keeping an ear to the ground for those opportunities. There's a lot of other manifestations of doing the homework. You heard some examples in Maylee's story. I'm gonna move us along because there's so much to say with each of these. But simplifying and streamlining paperwork is another key area of this. And again, there's no kind of like prescriptive approach, like you have to use a common application. There's a lot of different manifestations of this. I know Maylee has mentioned that this is an area where they might be working on even more. But the basic fundamental purpose of this is very connected to everything else we're talking about. It's this idea that nonprofit leaders are spending a lot of time on paperwork, a lot of extra, you know, there's been research done where an ED or a development director can spend anywhere between 15 to 30 hours on a proposal. I mean, imagine that. That's almost a full week of work. And so really kind of looking for ways to simplify that process, again, so that nonprofit leaders can really focus on the work at hand. Maylee,
yeah, simplify the process. And I have a question for you, Maylee, because in this particular space, I think not just do nonprofit leaders not are we just overwhelmed with paperwork. I actually think the paperwork and the structure, the entry point into funding actually doesn't have an equity lens that even considers, is the paperwork itself or the questions we're asking, are these the prerequisites for being a leader right now? Or what does this mean about language or aptitude or preparation? And again, my pain points are not to suggest that we become less rigorous, because we should apply rigor. I'm suggesting that we ask ourselves, why the why of the questions that we're asking, the how of the delivery, everything from even the inequities that we're seeing right now around which children have devices and who doesn't have devices when we're doing this kind of stay-at-home school, national school experiment. If we understand that X percentage of our students don't even have devices, are we actually saying that those students can't dream up really great ideas for how to create change for their communities, can't grow up to be amazing leaders? And yes, there's lots of pathways along the way where you would get a device. I'm using that as a low threshold, but I am saying that the entire entry point around paperwork needs to be re-examined so that with an equity lens, so that we ask ourselves, where are we with bias that we may not even know, keeping people who are worthy and have really great ideas outside of this process. And Maylee, it was a long time ago when I filled out the CLNIL application, but I actually in particular remember that you guys didn't use the common application, so I would love to know why. And I actually do feel that, especially even with a partnership and understanding the work we were doing, some of the questions were more allowed for more freedom and around the emotionality of what was happening, not just the concreteness of it. So can you just talk about your application and how you arrived at that?
Definitely. So, and this is something that we always balance. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are a family foundation and our board reads all the proposals. So we look at the application as an engagement tool for them. And so again, that's our balance where, you know, we're always trying to think that through on what makes sense. I do remember, Vanessa, when you applied, you asked me, you said, okay, when we do our application, should we focus on, some women want walking, some foundations want us because we do walking, some foundations want us because we focus on Black women. What should be our angle? And I remember saying to you, just be who you are, because in that fullness is the power of your work. And so they came to our boardroom and interviewed with our board, and everybody would typically wear a suit or something, and they came wearing tennis shoes and their walking shoes and really being their full selves in the work, which made a huge impact, I think, on our board and meeting from them and learning from them in that space. But this is an area, I would say, simplify and streamline paperwork, that we've just started the journey on. One thing we did do is now for reporting, we accept, and this happened 2 weeks ago, any annual reports or reports for other funders are fine for us. So organizations don't have to specifically do a report for us, because realistically, if it all has the same information.
A lot of Girl Treks funders have established that, and these are funders who give us multi-year, multi-million grants, who also have come back and said, one annual report or something you've already prepared. That has been significant for Girl Trek. Over the last 3 years, we have actually just focused on telling one powerful story through our annual report of our impact, and we just distribute it to everyone in that way. And then we also actually host quarterly stakeholder calls, and those stakeholder calls are open to our community. So it is both funders and women who walk, organizers, everyone, where we quarterly just come on to a Zoom exactly like this, and we walk through what our impact is, and then we actually walk through what our challenges have been, and we solicit feedback and input from our funders. And they have actually loved the feedback.
I love them. They're amazing. Yeah.
We don't want to wait till the end of the year to figure out what's going on. They actually like the kind of like 3 to 4 month informal, I was able to get a quick check-in, so I'm not doing homework at the end of the year to figure out what happened. So I do think that in simplifying and streamlining the paperwork, there's an opportunity to simplify and streamline the reporting of the impact so that it actually is quicker. Because I actually think quicker means that, this isn't working, we can actually make changes because this smart funder or person or partner has told me some great advice. So we actually really want to get the information out there as quick as possible, so that where there's an opportunity to correct or do better, we can.
And we actually found that in the grantee perception report, so I mentioned we have 4 grant programs. So the 2 grant programs that are the smaller amount of money, we're actually taking organizations more time than our larger grant programs. So that's something we're looking at and trying to figure out how to get the information, but that shouldn't be the case. That's not streamlining paperwork. So that's a practice we currently have, we're trying to figure out in that process as well. Mm-hmm. So we're a work in progress, I would say, on this one.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing about that journey. And one thing that Vanessa and Mei Li were just modeling right now is there's a transparency. I love that Vanessa invited Mei Li to share, you know, why didn't Clinial, or why hasn't Clinial used a common application? And that kind of showcases, you know, what happens, what results from a trust-based relationship. There is this relationship of honesty and transparency. Mei Li, how do you at Clinial, how does your team work to embody a transparent and responsive approach?
So I think from the very beginning, so most of our grant programs are open LOIs because we don't know everybody. And we also know that race and class and gender a lot of times unconsciously dictate who our network is. And so that's why we have both an open LOI or nomination process for our grant programs. Once an organization is invited to submit a proposal, and so this actually may help answer the question around new grants and unrestricted funding, either myself or a program officer, we go along with them in that proposal process. So the conversation that Vanessa and I had was a check-in process after they got the proposal to say, do you have any questions? Is anything not making sense? Anything too big or too small? We'll answer. So we are intentionally talking with them as they write the proposal. We don't write it for them, nor do we look at the text, but we do have conversations through that process. The second thing is, when I was in the business world, we always had policy of responding to everybody in 24 hours. And so we've brought that into the Clinial Foundation as well. So we don't care if we know you, if we don't know you. Probably the only people we don't respond to are investment advisors calling us and they want to manage our portfolio. Those are the only people we don't call back. But everybody else we call or respond back within 24 hours. And that's something we feel very strongly about.
Thank you. And you've mentioned a number of times soliciting and acting on feedback, specifically through the CEP perception report. That sounds like that's been kind of a common theme in your evolution and how you practice as a foundation. Has that always been kind of core to your approach, and how did you and when did you bring in the CEP surveying process?
Yeah. So we just brought in the CEP survey process. There is a cost to it. So that was just the consideration in thinking about doing that. I think we operate as a foundation by listening and then moving. And so that is core. And several of you asked, how do you build this trust, not only with grantees and with your board? So every year, myself and our senior program officer have a check-in call with our board. At the end of every year, we ask them the same questions: what's working, what's not working, and what else should we know? So that's our trust with the board, and I think to understand where their minds are. And with our grant programs, we are always asking them, even through a grant proposal review process, is there anything that could be better, not for us, but for future organizations applying to this? Are there any questions that could be tweaked? All of our descriptions on our website about our grant programs have been reviewed by grantees before we put them up to make sure that they make sense. So that's just always been how we've worked. And really anything that we do with our grantees is getting feedback and then actually sharing those direct quotes with our board, which also means giving up control. So there are many times where we've gone to a board meeting. For example, we had our first reunion with the Emerging Leaders Fund, and we got a lot of feedback from the attendees. And we shared that feedback with the board. We didn't know where our board was going to take it. So doing this is, it's great, but also just to realize it's taking off control on what I think my vision should be, having been here for 13 years, and putting that in the back seat and really saying, let's hear from those that we're serving, which are these nonprofits, and let's hear from them. And we may have to make tweaks that are uncomfortable, but we have to listen to them to move forward.
Thank you. And so that's another reminder too. The Center for Effective Philanthropy Grantee Perception Report is quite expensive. It's a hefty cost. There's a lot of ways to embed feedback in process. I love, for example, that Clinial gets grantee feedback on questions that you're asking in your reporting process. I mean, it's kind of, there's a lot of ways to incorporate that feedback and kind of be self-reflective and constantly looking for ways to refine. I'm going to keep moving us along. Finally, the last principle is offering support beyond the check. You've heard a little bit about the retreats that Clinial convenes. Vanessa was saying she never misses one of those gatherings. I'm going to start with Vanessa here. How have you experienced support beyond the check from Clinial and other funders? And what has been valuable to your organization?
Yeah, I will say, even before I go into deep with Clinial, which is literally best, I feel like best in class, there's no funder that I don't share what Clinial is doing, and they are always taking notes. But right now, in particular, I just want to lift up the funding community through the COVID-19 crisis. I can't tell you how many funders have reached out to one, literally. We had an amazing funder whose email just said, hey, checking in, but don't take any time to respond, you know, like, because she knows we're busy and she just wanted to check in. We have funders who are offering wellness and mindfulness activities that all of our staff can tune into. We have funders who set up webinars to go through how do you apply for the Payroll Protection Act, or like everything like that. People are just throwing the resources out there. And when I tell you that as a nonprofit leader behind the scenes on all of my WhatsApp and text groups, people are eating it up and like, hey, did you get that recording? Did you get those instructions? Did you apply? They're looking for resources for our staff, for our community. And so any of those kind of like beyond funding technical assistance things, people need them and want them. Maylee, you were telling people that you solicit feedback, but the way you do it is so thoughtful and so intentional. I just want to stop and emphasize it. Morgan and I actually always joke, literally there's no conversation or application or anything that happens with Clinial where Maylee doesn't send an email that says, hey, I think we should have a 30-minute check-in just where I could get your questions or get your feedback, and it is just so good and so pointed, and she's just like taking notes, and it's just so necessary. And then I will say this to all the funders on the call. We need money for sure, trust me, but I tell this to all of my nonprofit leaders. The support that we get beyond the money is so important, and in many of my relationships has been more important than the money. Clinial is one of those, and actually the most important thing that Clinial does for us is peer-to-peer connection. The learning community that Clinial creates via those retreats is what makes them powerful. It's not that we drink wine or have cheese, which we do, but that's not it. It's actually that they curate fairly unstructured time for us as nonprofit leaders to come together and talk to each other, and they stay out of the way as much as possible. They essentially say, hey, we trust our selection process, we believe in these leaders, and then they just put us all in a room together for 2 to 3 days, and we're able to talk about family stuff, about financial stuff, about mental health stuff. One of the best parts of the retreat is on the last day we do a give-get. We literally sit in a circle and you just say, I need this. Does somebody in the circle have it? And then you say, I have this to give. Does anybody in the circle need it? It is so powerful. And the number of referrals I've got for graphic designers or office space or lawyers or business plans that I could copy from because they're like, oh, I already did that. Just use my words. It's so good. And so that relationship building that Clinial does, and you do it through lots of ways, Maylee, but the number one way that I appreciate it is, the agenda is not overwrought, right? It's not overwrought with like all of these, let's read this paper and do this thing and watch this. It's literally, let's have a conversation. Let's approach this as a human centered situation that we're coming together. And you do it from the design of it. She calls us in advance. She says, hey, how did last year go? What did you like? What did you not like? From the food to the this to the that, what are their ideas? And then each year she has a past grantee come and facilitate it. So she's only like the secondary facilitator. And those peer-to-peer relationships right now in this world that we live in, where people are scrambling, and we need to have more of that, more of that, more of that. So any way that funders can bring that together, people would be game.
Thank you. So we're now in our Q&A portion. I want to surface a couple great questions that came up through the chat during our discussion. One is from Amy Stringer-Hessel. Great question about this focus on relationships. So with a focus on relationship, what are the boundaries that are important for a funder to keep in mind? Amy says that she's seen the situation where a funder starts to feel like they have a role in running the program, maybe too much of a partner. So can you two comment on this? What does that relationship look like, and what are those boundaries? Because we're not talking about people being kind of, funders being like all up in the activities of the nonprofit. So can you please, both of you, comment on that?
I think of myself as a student of their work. That's a lot of times how I talk about it, and really learning from them. And having been a former ED of a nonprofit, I would never want any funder in my business. So I probably take that experience with me, and they're the experts. We're not the experts. And actually, going back to the grantee survey report, there was one question where it said, do we understand the socioeconomic realities of the nonprofits? And I understood that as a diversity, equity, inclusion question. So I was hoping we were going to do really well. We ranked really low on that question. The written pieces from a lot of our grantees were saying, focus on the relationship, focus on the organization. We know our communities. We are not expecting you to know our community well. Let us be the experts, and then support us how we want to support us. And so that's what we try to do in the relationships. Vanessa, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I understand from the beginning, or have understood, that grant agreements are insufficient when they come to communication clauses, and we actually upfront intentionally set expectations around communication and reporting. Sorry, clearly this is what happens when you work from home. Electronic music. We set examples around reporting and just informal communication up front. Literally hey, can you tell us what do you prefer? Do you prefer that we communicate via email? Do you want to get this and that? And in that conversation, we establish what we're not going to do also, which is, we're going to give you updates, but there's no expectation, and it shouldn't be on your end that you're designing the program or having input. But we intentionally have that conversation up front. What we actually have found is, I will say Girl Trek has 60% of our funders are individual philanthropists. Only about 30% of our funders are foundations. So that could be relevant for this conversation. But in our conversations, we found that it varies so much, and people are grateful. Even foundations, when they have it in the clause, they're grateful if you circle back with them just to say, hey, the clause says that you want an annual report and you want this, but also we do quarterly stakeholder calls, or we do emails. Would you like any of those things? If you offer or get that understanding at the beginning, I feel like you avoid some of that stuff down the line.
Thank you. Great tips. We've got a couple questions coming in. This is a hot topic that comes up quite a bit in discussions around trust-based philanthropy, and we've got a couple on impact. So one question is, how do you choose nonprofits that are actually making an impact, moving the needle with data, and being financially healthy and sustainable? How do you identify nonprofit partners that are genuinely committed to making a difference and proving their impact?
So one, for the multi-year grants, again, we do ask them for annual milestones, which can be organizational, which can be programmatic. So that's where that fits. We also say we know that they may change. And by being in relationship with them, things that cause those changes are different than what I would assume. So for example, one organization was struggling because I think they had about 10 staff. Six of the 10 were about to go on maternity leave all at the same time. So how do you manage that? That has an impact on impact, but that would never be in a grant proposal. I would have never thought to ask that during due diligence. So what I've learned, that the aspects that challenge organizations from moving forward are things that I never would have thought have. And so I think following that, we as a foundation have a better understanding of what organizations are going through, and then also what boosts them forward in terms of impact. It could be another funder, all of a sudden, there are just so many factors that we could not imagine over 4 years, over 2 or 3 years. And I think our job isn't to say, you didn't get this, we don't want to fund you. It's more to say, let's be along with the journey, and let's try to understand where you're going and why. And how do we learn from that as a funder? And I can tell you, the more we learn, the more humble I am to know that I cannot predict the work that they're doing, and also how do we be realistic about the amount of our grants and what can truly move the needle.
Thank you. Yeah, please, Vanessa, go ahead.
Hey, really quickly, I think funders also have to ask the grantees or work with them to understand what is realistic to measure now versus what can you don't have the infrastructure, but we could support you in building up the infrastructure to measure later, because there's a ripple effect around our work. Most of our work is very sophisticated. Girl Trek originally, in the first couple of years, all we were really able to measure was habit formation. Are women walking or are they not walking? How many minutes and how many organizers that we have. But we know that we have a ripple effect of how many people are in the household, how many medications have you got off of, how did you get civically involved? Like, there's so many other things, but we honestly didn't have the expertise to measure those things on our own. And that's where we've had funders who've come in and say, okay, this is all your impact. We know you have a larger impact, but all you're capable of measuring right here is now, but we see the bigger vision. Let us help you over these next couple of years, build up those measuring tools so that we can start to look at this larger impact. We know you have it. We understand you can't measure it right now. Let's help you to measure it. And I think nonprofits could be leaning in more to help nonprofits to get there and arrive at the place that they want them to be.
Thank you. You know, there's an Ernest Hemingway quote that says, the only way to know that you can trust someone is to trust them. And I think there's, it's in what Vanessa was just sharing. It's this idea of building that relationship and believing in the vision of the nonprofit leaders. Most of the people who are doing work in nonprofits, I would say the vast majority are really committed to genuine impact. It's just not always going to be something that's going to happen tomorrow. So investing that time in doing the homework, building the relationship, understanding the vision of nonprofit leaders is a good starting point for that relationship. And then, as Vanessa shared, I love that example of, like, you know, you've had funders that believe in the vision and want to help you get there. And that's where that support beyond the check comes in. And that's where the relational approach really has a lot of power. Another question kind of related to this impact question. So Mei Lee, you were talking about recognizing that there's all these other variables that can get in the way of a nonprofit's ability to achieve their goals or their impact, and your multi-year relationships have opened up these new learnings, right? But how does Clinial assess, like, what is Clinial's approach to outcomes and metrics? Like, what are you kind of assessing and reporting to the board in terms of Clinial's impact?
So because we cover a lot of different issues, we are very different than, for example, the foundation I came from before, as we just focus on community economic development in low wealth communities. So it was a very specific focus. And so we actually had our own metrics. We had a research team. We were able to follow that and see actually where the needle did move. At Clinial, you know, we've supported Girl Trek, we've supported education organizations, environmental organizations. So we don't have the ability, nor do I think it's worth our resources to assess them across issue areas. So we really let the organizations lead that, because education organizations, if you support education, that's probably the easiest issue area to follow impact and to look at impact. If you're an environmental organization, that's a whole different story. And they're doing great work, but it looks different. So we really let them lead, and we let them define it, because they're defining it not only for us, they're defining it for their community, they're defining it for other funders. And so we let them lead with what that should be. We do not have comparison across different organizations.
Thank you. Two couple interesting questions. One came in earlier about based on this relational approach. I think, if I understand, Gregory, this question is kind of about being able to managing the capacity for relationship, right? So, you know, as a foundation, you have a set number of grantees. A relational approach requires time. So how do you at Clinial kind of think about right-sizing your grantee pool for the capacity that you have? Because I believe you've got a team of 3 staff, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
And I will say this, every grantee thinks Mei Lee is their best friend. So I don't know how you manage this, Mei Lee. I also would like to hear.
Yeah, how do you do it?
Real quick, before Maylee answers that, I just want to kind of tag on a question I got here, which is about decreasing the number of grants while increasing the average size. How can a funder award small grants effectively engage as well? So I don't know if
Yeah.
you kind of lump that in there.
So that is really important strategic question for you and your board. We went from, as I mentioned, about 140 grants a year to now we have 68. And that was really hard. And I have to say, even myself, as well as our staff and a couple of our board members, through that process, I talked with them about really going through a grieving process because we had to say no to organizations. And when we said no, it was because of an internal decision that we made, not because of the work that they were doing. So that is very, very hard. I did read a study before we went through this transition that to do relationship-based grant making, each program officer should have, I would say, 30 to 40 grantees. So that's what we were looking at. And that's ironically about what we have now. And it works and it's doable. I think if you want to have 200 grants and 2 people managing them, this would be hard unless you prioritize which were relationship-based and which were transactional. And that would be, again, for the smaller grants. We had some grants, and I think I saw in the chat, they were $15,000 a year. That's our local grant making program is $15,000 per year. So we also have relationships with them. They're 3-year grants that allows us to do that. So I don't think the size matters.
Uh-oh, Shandy, you're on.
Yeah. I think another point, and that's connected to something that Vanessa said earlier, is that the relationships are going to look different. You know, in a trust-based context, oftentimes the grantee partner is setting the terms. A grantee might want to be able to check in more frequently. Some grantee partners might prefer to have funders that are hands-off. So sometimes too, it's about figuring out and kind of gauging each relationship. Some might require more hands-on involvement and some don't. So sometimes that will also help balance it out. I want to raise this other question that came in that is really interesting, and I think it has to do a little bit with the PTSD that some nonprofit leaders might have if they're coming out of experience with very toxic funder relationships. And the question is, how do you manage, and I would love to hear from both of you on this, because how do you, so the question is targeted to a funder perspective, but how do you kind of work to build relationship with a nonprofit leader who might be very guarded because of previously toxic relationships? And similarly, Vanessa, have you personally had to kind of undo some of the trauma of a toxic funder relationship, and how have you kind of worked to undo that in your more positive funder relationships?
You want to go, Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, honest to God, I'm on a daily journey to readjust my relationship with wealth and money. And I'm sure I'm not the only nonprofit leader who has experienced this. I do everything. I've been reading the Law of Attraction, Marianne Williamson's, like, how do I just readjust even my own viewpoint, right? Because you have to look at the funder like they're also a whole person, and whether they're an individual person or they control millions of dollars at a foundation, like they're coming to this with their own values, their own passion. And how do you, I personally struggled with this, so I don't have an answer is what I'm saying, is that it is a awareness that we, especially in communities of color, especially when we're talking about equity, the relationship that we have with money and with resources and with justice, and who has resources and who doesn't have resources, and historically why that is deep. And there's a lot of hurt and there is a lot of trauma around it. And so for me, it is like, I just have to acknowledge that. And mostly with most of my funders, I say that, like, I say, like, this is what I'm experiencing. So I don't have an answer for what I'm doing right this second, except working through it and dealing with it. The best advice I ever received from a funder was exactly around this. It was an individual philanthropist in New York City, sitting in her apartment in Central Park where the elevators opened right up. And my partner and Morgan and I were in her apartment for over an hour, and we were just sweating, just trying to pitch this thing and she just said, look, girls, she was like, you're not asking me a favor. You're asking me to invest in a powerful solution. You're giving me an opportunity to actually come along with something that I should actually, it's like, it would be a privilege for me. And she was like, you need to shift your mindset about that. You're not asking me to borrow you some money. You're saying, I have a powerful solution. Do you want an opportunity to invest in it? And it was just like the gut check that we needed. And I've tried to carry her voice into every space that I have, but it is very hard. And I will just say, maybe to the funders, give grace to folks who have maybe $15,000 might be the most money a person has ever physically put their hands on, and it could transform their whole families, but they're using that money to invest into an idea they believe in. It's hard. It's just hard.
And I would say to that point, that's what's been helpful for us about this trust-based framework. It's given myself and our staff a tool to talk about that. So if there is somebody that, you know, that, and it takes, honestly, looking back, like it probably takes 2 or 3 years to really build the trust. I feel like I have to earn it, not the organization. Like I have to prove to myself that we're real. I have to prove that we really want to listen. I have to prove, several grantees have said, look, I'm scared to tell you what's really going on because we're scared you're going to punish us and not fund us. So I have to prove that. I have a lot of proving to do, and it typically is over 2 to 3 years. And I think the difference of gender, difference of race, difference of class, those 3 aspects can impact how long it takes to build a relationship depending on the life experiences of different people. And that's real. And that translates into money, sadly. Echo and Green did a study where they looked at all their past grantees by race and gender, and they found that white men raised the most, then it was white women, then it was Black men, and then it was Black women. And this is across issue, across organization. So that ability to build trust earlier among like people has actually translated into dollars flowing. And I think as a funder, I'm very aware of that. And know that I feel like every new relationship, I feel like I have the proof. I'm the person who has to prove the sincerity.
Thank you. That's really, you know, flipping that power dynamic. Thank you for that. Kelly, if you don't mind putting our key takeaways slide up. So just a few broad strokes, key takeaways that we hope you heard in some of the stories today. First and foremost, trust-based philanthropy starts with your organizational culture and values. I can't stress this enough, and it was one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about doing the homework. Really first getting clear on what your organizational values are as a foundation, and what your vision and mission is. Being very clear about that from the starting point can really help drive a lot of the work. You heard a lot of that in the way Mei Li was talking about Clinial's evolution. And of course, you know, connected to this, it's not just about what you do in policy and practice, but how you actually show up. That is a huge part. We've got some resources on the Trust-Based Philanthropy website, tips for building trust-based relationships. I'll work with Kelly to make sure you get all the appropriate links for all that stuff after this. Again, alleviating burdens on nonprofits benefits foundations too. You heard some examples from Mei Li on the learnings that her foundation has been able to develop with these multi-year relationships, being able to have a relationship over time and see that impact over time. You know, new learnings, new ways of looking at kind of what nonprofits need to be healthy and successful. These are just a few examples. One other thing I've heard from trust-based practitioners is there's just a lot more joy in the work. People who've come out of traditional philanthropy, who have been embracing trust-based practices, feel more connected to the purpose behind what they're doing, and there's just more joy. And there's a lot of magic in that. Keeps people in their positions longer. And finally, this is a journey, not a checklist. And I really appreciate Mei Li sharing that there's areas that Clinial they're still working on, and that's fine. You know, this whole process is about being reflective, you know, refining as we go, taking that feedback as we go, and really embracing this journey and just being true to those values. So if you take anything from that, those are some of the big pieces. Any final reflections, knowing that we have 5 minutes, Vanessa, Maylee, any other kind of quick points or takeaways you would want people to walk away with?
My point and takeaway would be that nonprofit leaders are eager to have these conversations, and that as a starting point within your own portfolio of folks that you fund, to be brave to have the conversations, to have the convenings, to ask for input. The most uncomfortable conversations around race, around class, around metrics, around do I even understand how you're articulating your vision, around the different language. I mean, let's just have the conversations. People are eager. They want to have the conversations, and they will be very receptive to them as we build solutions together.
I would say it's so easy for me to slip into the privilege in philanthropy and forget that I have that privilege. And so I'm constantly reminded of that. And I always remember a study that was done by a foundation that funds organizations that get into roadblocks. So if they get into roadblock, they can apply to this foundation for funding. And so they've actually done a study of what caused the roadblocks. The number one cause of the roadblocks for those organizations were funders. So I don't think they were bad intentioned, but I keep that with me really close and realize that even though we're intentional about doing this work, I work in privilege and I work with power, and it creates a lot of blind spots for me. So I'm always trying to remind myself and check those blind spots that I have in this work.
Thank you. These are some final steps that you can take. Hopefully this is not the last time we connect with you on trust-based philanthropy. Ask yourself if you're able or willing to unrestrict any dollars in this moment. It's needed now more than ever. I know that's a cliche phrase, but, and if you do, see how that works and consider sticking with it in the long run. We've got a great 2-pager that outlines some rationale behind these principles. There's a survey coming. Please let us know what you think. If you're interested in more programming, we would love to come back and do a deeper dive. Finally, here's my email address for those of you who have any follow-up questions. I'm here to support you, connect you to others, and help you in any way in your journeys. So feel free to be in touch, and I'll hand it back to Deb.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank you again, Maylee, Vanessa, and Shadi, for joining us today and for elevating this really important grant-making strategy. There's so much to learn, and there's so much that's applicable to what's happening right now in the world. Shadi, I'm really grateful for your generosity personally, and also for TVP's generosity in sponsoring and leading this conversation today for us and also around the country. We're really grateful to TVP for that. So please share that with your colleagues. It means a lot. Thanks to GCG team members, Kelly Connor and Heather Jonas, for your help in creating and implementing our event today. Please see the survey link that's in your chat box and offer your feedback, as Shadi suggested. We're also going to be sending the link out in a follow-up email. So if you could take a few minutes to let us know what you thought of the program today and whether you'd like to have another follow-up program to this one specifically, we'd love to hear from you on that. Really quickly, want to remind you that we have a next member call on Thursday this week, April 16th, for those of you who are losing track of time. That's this Thursday at 2 o'clock. And we're going to have Diane Drollinger, who's the executive director of the Network for Strong Communities, which is the nonprofit intermediary here in town, report on results that she's received thus far from a study that NSC has done on the nonprofit needs in the wake of COVID-19. So you can RSVP on our website for that all-member call. We've had really robust participation on these member calls. We've had from 50 to 60 funders on every one, and we really appreciate the feedback we're getting from you about the need for these conversations. On Thursday's call, we're going to have more time for discussion this time and some general updates from the group. We've had some speakers designated over the past couple calls, and we recognize it's important to have a chance just for funders to talk freely without a structured speaker. So Diane will be the one structured speaker on Thursday. As always, thank you all for your time today, and let's all take care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you.